Hello to everyone who's joining us this afternoon or morning or maybe evening, wherever you are in the world, for our Food Packaging Forum webinar on substances of very high concern in food contact materials. I'm very pleased to welcome our two speakers who are with us this afternoon. First of all, we have Dr. Birgit Goyke, who's Scientific Officer at Food Packaging Forum, and she's also the main author of the study that she will present shortly on substances of very high concern in food contact materials, a study that was published recently. And welcome also to Dr. Michael Warhurst, who is the Executive Director of ChemTrust, a non-profit organization based in the UK that focuses on chemicals and health. And very glad, Michael, that you could join us here today for our webinar. We have about 10 minutes for each talk, and after the talks I will gladly invite everyone on the webinar to ask questions. Please send us your questions by email under events@fp-forum.org, and I will share that email address again in a second. Before we start, I just want to very briefly take this opportunity to introduce the Food Packaging Forum to those of you who don't know us yet. We're a charitable foundation established almost 5 years ago based in Zurich, Switzerland. We do science communication on chemicals in all types of food contact materials, and we're interested in how these chemicals migrate, if they do migrate into food, and what the impact on health is from exposure to those chemicals in food. We focus on current scientific research, cutting-edge topics, and we have a vast amount of information material available for you freely on our website. You can also subscribe to our newsletter, which appears twice a month. We have dossiers on certain topics and webinars and so on, and we're also always happy to get feedback from the people who find our information material useful. So please let us know if you like our work or if you have a specific topic that you would like us to cover. That would be great. And last but not least, we're funded by donations. We're a charity, so if you want to support the FPF's work, then please consider making a donation to the foundation. Great, and here is the agenda for our webinar today. And you can see the email address at the bottom of the slide, events@fp-forum.org. Again, if you have any questions or would like to comment on the webinar, then please send us your comments to this email address, and I hope that we can get to as many questions as possible. And without much further ado, I would like to hand over to Birgit, who will be the first speaker of our webinar today, talking about migration of substances of very high concern from food contact materials. Over to you, Birgit.
Thank you, Jane. I hope everybody can hear me and also see me. It should be there. I should be there in a second. I'm there. That's good to hear. Okay, so welcome to our second webinar. And this time I would like to present you our latest scientific study, which was published 2 weeks ago in the journal Packaging Science and Technology, and it deals with migration of substances of very high concern, a topic which is of high importance to our work. Here you see a screenshot or a copy of the PDF file. So if you're interested in reading the whole file, you can either get it from the Packaging Technology and Science website, or you can also contact us in case you have difficulties in obtaining it. The title of the study was Substances of Very High Concern in Food Contact Materials, Migration and Regulatory Background. And why did we work on this topic? So the European legislation on FCMs is rather, let's call it, maybe complicated to understand. So the basic of the FCM legislation is the FCM framework regulation. And if you look at the aspects human health and also the aspect or the impact an FCM could have on the environment, you also have to look at REACH. So I will come to that later. So the FCM framework regulation says that FCMs shall not transfer the constituents to food in quantities which could endanger human health. So the human health is clearly covered by this basic regulation on food contact materials. But furthermore, REACH, the European Chemicals Regulation, covers also the environmental effects of the FCM substances. But to stress this point, it does not cover the effects on human health. The FCM framework regulation is not providing all the details which are necessary to produce safe food contact materials. And to provide details, there are a few, maybe not enough. That's a point of discussion maybe for later on. But there are a few harmonized regulations. The most important one is that on plastic food contact materials. Then there are quite several national regulations on different types of food contact materials. And then something we also have to say, there are quite some regulatory gaps because certain materials, for example, are not regulated or not really fully regulated, and it's difficult to decide what is really needed to fulfill the requirements of the framework regulation. More information on these topics can be found in the baseline study, which was published in the end of last year by the European Commission's Joint Research Center. You can find the link later on down here. Then coming to REACH. As I said, REACH does not cover the human health effects of food contact materials. However, REACH is highly considering or aims at the substitution of substances of very high concern, of chemicals which are defined to be a hazard to human health and also a hazard for the environment. And I will tell you what these SVHCs, how they are defined. So SVHCs under REACH are defined as chemicals that have serious and often irreversible effects on human health and the environment. And these effects include that they are carcinogenic, mutagenic, and toxic for reproduction. They are persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. Very persistent and very accumulative. One of these two definitions should fit, or they are of equivalent levels of concern. And that, for example, includes if they are endocrine disruptors. To become an SVHC, a chemical has to undergo a quite long authorization process. So first, it is placed on a list of SVHCs, the so-called candidate list, and that results in legal obligations for the manufacturers of these substances. Then there are several more steps involving certain European institutions and also the public and the European Commission until a candidate SVHC can become a chemical that needs authorization for use. And once a chemical, an SVHC, is underwent this process and is placed on the so-called authorization list or Annex 14, then manufacturers cannot use it unless they do have an authorization for use of these chemicals. But, and that's very important in our in this context, food contact materials are exempted from this. So food contact materials can be produced with these chemicals although they don't have an official authorization under REACH. That's the legal situation. And that's a situation we found a little bit surprising, let's call it like this. And that's why we went on and checked what chemicals are allowed to be used or are used in food contact materials and need to be authorized in all other products you can imagine almost. And what we found in the study, and that's the key finding of the study, that there are 10 substances which are used in food contact materials or have strong indications to be used in food contact materials, but they are subject to authorization under REACH. And here you can see the list. And if you have a closer look at the list, you see 4 phthalates, you see 2 primary aromatic amines, you see halogenated substances, you see a solvent, and yeah, that's more or less this short list, which is expected to grow longer over time. And now having a look at the applications or the possible applications of these chemicals in FCMs. If we go to the plastics regulation and look into Annex 1 of the plastics regulation, the so-called union list, we see that 4 of these chemicals are authorized to be used in food contact materials or in plastic food contact materials. There are 3 phthalates, and tris-chloroethyl phosphate is also allowed to be used to produce plastic food contact materials. The numbers you see in brackets are the so-called specific migration limits. That's the amount of chemical in milligram per kilogram which is allowed to be in the food after the food was in contact with this material. And you see, for example, for the phthalates, it's between 0.3 and 30 milligram per kilogram. For the tris-chloroethyl phosphate, it should be non-detectable in the food after the food was in contact with the packaging or the food contact material. So the specifications and restrictions are quite different, and the others are not allowed to be used in plastic food contact materials, the other 6 substances. Then we have also analyzed 2 other lists, the so-called ESCO list and the facet list. You can find the details on this list in the paper. Just to explain it shortly, these are inventory lists that are not only legal lists, but also it's quite difficult to find the exact sources, but it's compiling a lot of different sources in these 2 lists, and they contain several thousand substances. And you see that some more substances are listed on the ESCO list, and 9 of 10 substances from the authorization list are on the facet list. Here it's more difficult to find the exact use and all this, but anyway, we have included it and went on to check whether these substances are also found in FCMs and in food. But very quickly going back to REACH, here I've listed the reasons for inclusion on the authorization list, or the reason why these substances became an SVHC, and you see that all the phthalates are toxic for reproduction, and recently they were classified as human endocrine disruptor, and DEHP is also a human and environmental endocrine disruptor. Then there are 3 carcinogens. There are 2 more substances which are toxic for reproduction, and 1, the HBCD, which is a flame retardant, is persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic. As I said before, we were interested whether these chemicals are, first of all, used, and second, if they really migrate from the packaging or from the FCM into the food. And we checked all the available, or most of the available scientific literature. We went into the database of the Rapid Alert System for Food and Feed, and we saw that the phthalates are, they are widely used in all different packaging, and they do migrate from the packaging into the food. That's something we have to conclude, and we have to say like this. So they were migrating from plastic packaging, from paper and board, whether it was virgin or recycled, but also from the machines which were used, for example, for milking machines in the tubes and the tanks, and also phthalates were heavily migrating from the lids which are used to close glass jars. Then the primary aromatic amine, the methylene dianiline, MDA, that was used at fairly small concentrations in multilayer films and at fairly high concentration in black polyamide cooking utensils. And the other 5 substances, we did not find any evidence for their use in food contact materials, and also we did not find any evidence for their that they are available or that they are present in food. Excuse me. So here we don't have any data to say they are used or they do migrate. We have no evidence. So maybe they are absent. Maybe they have never been measured. And then we discussed ways forward, because we think it's not acceptable that substances which have these hazard properties and which shall be phased out under REACH, that they are still used at sometimes fairly high concentrations in FCMs. And for that we discussed 3 different scenarios. So all of these substances which I've shown you before are banned under REACH, but their use in FCMs is different. So some of them are authorized and legally used in FCMs. For example, the phthalates, which are used in plastic FCMs. But regarding the recent decisions under REACH, we think a reassessment, at least under the FCM legislation, should be done in near future. Then the second scenario would be that the substance is banned under REACH, and it's neither allowed in FCMs, but however it is found in FCMs, and that you could see for MDA, which is not allowed in plastic FCMs, definitely not on the list, but fairly often found. And there, a stricter enforcement could be a way to improve or reduce the levels of MDA and improve the safety of these materials. And the third thing we discussed when we checked or when we looked for information on these 5 substances where we didn't find any information, then we said maybe nobody ever looked for it, or maybe it's not a problem at all. So that should be somehow highlighted. So just as an example, HBCD may be present in some styrofoam or some polystyrene, but there maybe the data have to be generated in future. Let me go back once. So if you want to read the details, you're most welcome to check the study or contact us. And there is also something else I would like to mention. There is a supplementary material on the journal's homepage, which you can download there. Even if you don't have access to the paper, you can get the supplementary material. It is an update of our 2014 study, which was also included there in the supplementary material, so maybe it's of interest to you. And with that, I would like to thank you, and I hope that we have time for questions later on today. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Birgit, for that very compact information. And I also would just like to reiterate, if you would like to receive a copy of the full study that Birgit just spoke about, then just send us an email and we can share the study with you. And with that, I would like to ask Michael Warhurst to please take over. Michael will be speaking about policy implications coming from ChemTrust, which is a non-profit organization that engages in political discussions about chemical safety. And Michael is an expert on chemical regulations. So without much further ado, Michael, I would like you to please share your thoughts with us.
Thank you, Jane, and thanks for inviting me to talk on this and also for the interesting research you've been doing. So I'm giving a quick presentation on chemicals in food contact materials from our point of view as ChemTrust. So I'll give a quick introduction to ChemTrust, something about the EU regulation of chemicals in food contact materials, because we really come from the sort of REACH side mainly. Just the pizza box example, I'm sure many of you have already heard of. And some of the general holes with the current regulations, and the fact that we do have some interesting signs of action on the policy side now after some period of not much happening, and what do we want as well from our view. So just on ChemTrust first, we're a charity. We work mainly at EU level on chemicals, protecting humans and wildlife from harmful chemicals. We work with scientists who work in technical processes, particularly around REACH, but also other ones, decision makers, and we work with a wide range of other civil society groups in Brussels and elsewhere. We have a particular focus on identification of and action on endocrine disrupting chemicals. And you can see the sort of things we are doing through our blog and Twitter account. And, we try and have quite clear discussion on the main issues we're working on our blog. So to get on to this, so the EU regulation of chemicals in food contact, obviously you've already heard something about this. I'll do this from a slightly different angle. Obviously the key regulation is this 2004 one, materials and articles intended to come into contact with food, with the general safety requirement of not endangering human health, which is quite a broad statement. And of course that legislation includes provision for much more detailed daughter legislation, where you could have positive lists of chemicals. And this has been done for plastic materials, and it's been done for a few other things, but for the bulk well, not the bulk, but for a significant section of food contact materials, that is not the case. So paper, ink, coatings, adhesives, board, for example, are not covered by these harmonized regulations. And just here's an example of a board packaging. Pizza boxes are often made from recycled paper or card. And when you have recycling, there's a lot of issues. I mean, it's a bit of a debate now in the area of circular economy. And I spoke at Commission event last Thursday on this issue, how you deal with chemicals and the circular economy. But you have stuff going into the system from chemicals from ink and glue and paper and coatings, which can contaminate the recycled materials. This can be coming from other packaging, food packaging, non-food packaging, or indeed from other sources. So one example is work in Denmark, where they found pizza boxes containing an interesting range of materials, chemicals, bisphenol A, which may be from thermal paper, where it's being banned over the next 3 years in the EU, phthalates, which obviously mentioned in the current paper that Food Packaging Forum published, mineral oils, non-alphenol, strangely enough, and perfluorocarbons. It's also the case that you may have deliberate use of perfluorocarbons in paper packaging. I have heard that you have both some addition of perfluorocarbons during paper production, actually at the mill each, and also there can be coatings afterwards. And these perfluorocarbons, there's around 3,000 available on the market, generally break down into persistent pollutants, and many are known to be toxic at the moment. Others, there's a lack of information. And in fact, last week we produced a report called No Brainer about the concerns about chemical impacts on brain development. And in fact, perfluorocarbons are one of the ones on that list, as is indeed bisphenol A and similar chemicals. So we have a system which is a bit weird, I must say. When I first discovered about this food contact regulation, I did find it quite strange that you would have a positive union list of chemicals used in plastic food contact materials, where you have a risk assessment process from EFSA, but there's no EU list for these other materials. And in most other, in general, most member states do not have comprehensive systems. Individual member states may be better than others on individual materials. And recycling, again, shows a strange contrast, where if you're recycling plastic into a new food contact material like bottles, get that process approved by EFSA. But if you're recycling paper or card, you don't have to get an approval service. Most member states are not really regulating this, and you can have disagreement as to where you are or aren't allowed to use recycled paper and card in food contact. So the human health risks of chemicals in these substances, PCAB materials, are largely unregulated. And crucially, within REACH, they're actually specifically excluded. The human health aspects are specifically excluded from a REACH chemical safety report and from authorization process. These are not the only problems. There's this general lack of overlap between REACH and food contact material legislation, which may be partly due to the fact that the legislation was essentially being developed at the same time, without really much overlap as far as you could tell. And as this study shows, you can get an SVHC in REACH, but there's no automatic action within FCM uses. And there's a lack of effective link between data gathered in REACH and the food contact material regulatory processes. And we did have a workshop we ran last year, which notes are available, where we specifically tried to look at the overlap between those two aspects. Obviously, within food contact material, there are major scientific and technical challenges. There's intentionally added substances, what really goes into food, which, is in fact a broader chemicals policy issue, and at least in food contract it's talked about. In most chemicals policy it's largely ignored. And obviously exposure to mixtures, which is the real world that we live in. And I think there are other concerns around enforcement. Is anyone checking the rules are being followed anyway? The study mentions research which has found quite a lot of migration from lids, for example, where it's very unclear the extent to which anything was being enforced there. And then there were real concerns in various countries that as you get cuts in public budgets in those countries that are going for austerity in a big way, you end up with even less money going into this enforcement. And obviously, because of the difficulties in the law, they're actually quite difficult to enforce. And so you end up with a situation where essentially people are rewarded for not making the effort. So it's not a pretty picture, and I do think the public would be very surprised about this. It's pretty fundamental that your food should be packed in something that's properly regulated. And whenever you do a focus group or something with the public, there is a general assumption that things don't go into products. Chemicals don't go into products unless they've been shown to be safe. And really that's not the situation in this area. It's not. There's a certain amount of publicity coming out on things like mineral oils in certain countries like Germany, but there's real potential for more of a scandal in the future, because it's clearly not a stable, controlled situation. And so we are also, because we're not investigating these areas enough, we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. There's massive uncertainties to exactly what is present where. It was very good that the European Parliament passed a detailed report calling for improvements in the laws in October 2016. And, over the past few years, the Commission has been quite resistant to doing much about this, usually using this argument that it took 10 years to do the plastic chemicals, how can we do anything else? But we have some interesting signs now. Just before Christmas, one of the Santé officials talked about evaluating the regulation, but complained about the fact that it would take 1 or 2 centuries for doing the current process to assess chemicals, which is quite interesting because that's the argument that was being used, I'd say 18 years ago, when people first started to discuss a real revision of the chemicals policy in Europe. Those were the arguments that were used about how difficult it was to do, and that led to the creation of REACH. So in some ways the food contact material argument is rather outdated. Then the Joint Research Centre report was published in January 2017, which was very clear on a very large number of different problems with the current regulatory system. And I think it's notable from the end of January that, again, the Commission officials were clear that there is something going to be done. There's going to be an evaluation of the laws. There's going to be potentially immediately, before the evaluation is finished, some sort of action on printed food contact materials, and there's more studies ongoing. So it does look like something is going to happen, but from our view, and we have a briefing on this, is that we really need to move to a situation where you have harmonized regulations for all these different materials. You have action to substitute SVHCs and EDCs with safer alternatives. You have proper assessment of NIAS, amongst other things. And you can see our detailed position on there. And I think to conclude, it's clear that the laws, as they stand, are not an acceptable situation. And I think that's the view of the public, and from what I've spoken to industry, most of the industry is not particularly happy with the legal situation at the moment, because it's too uncertain, too complex, and not protective either of them or of health properly. We need protective EU harmonised regulation of all chemicals in food contact applications, including for recycled materials, and it is strange to have an EU law obliging recycling of packaging, but not an EU law addressing the chemical content of this packaging unless it's plastic. We know the Commission's going to do something. We don't have a massive amount of confidence in DG Santé. And also, we need to try and make sure that the new approach is good, but we do have a problem that DG Santé, in our experience, is actually quite resistant to civil society, differently from DG Environment and even DG Grow, who are in the REACH debate tend to be much more open to discussions. And I'll leave it there. I have some references and we can make sure the talk is available at the end. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael, for some candid words there and for this excellent talk. We are recording the webinar and we will make it available on our website as soon as we're done here. So if you want to go back and look at the slides, you can also find those on foodpackagingforum.org. Great. And so I would like to now move forward and ask some questions which we received from the participants here today. I will paste them here so you can also read them if I can master the technology. So the first question is to Birgit. And Birgit, how did you choose the 10 substances that you reviewed in the article?
So if we compared, for example, the candidate list of substances of very high concern, the number strongly increased to more than 50 substances. But to start with, we have chosen only these 10 because it's quite an effort to really go into the literature and check all what is available. And of course, these are the substances which have a recognized health effect and should be avoided as it is concluded under REACH. So they should be substituted in future. And we think whenever they are substituted in all different products, one should at least think about their substitution in FCMs too.
Great, thank you, Birgit. While we wait for other questions to come in, either for Birgit or Michael, maybe Michael, I can ask you. You mentioned that when a substance lands on the SVHC list, so when it becomes a substance of very high concern, no automatic action is triggered for food contact materials. Could you maybe go into that a little bit more? What do you mean with that?
Okay, essentially what we have is that there isn't, it's really the REACH system and the food contact materials system exist in two separate worlds. So in the REACH system, evidence will be looked at about a chemical. If it meets criteria to be designated a substance of very high concern, it'll then be you can go through another prioritization process. There's quite a lot of levels to go in and become on the candidate list. And then those chemicals on the candidate list can then be prioritized for action. And then a sunset date will be put in place where it says you must apply, all uses of this chemical will cease by this sunset date, subject to any exemptions, unless you apply for further use, you apply for an authorization. So companies must apply for authorization for continued use of those chemicals. And so all that exists in what you might call the REACH world of industrial chemicals, which could be chemicals in furniture or electrical goods or paints or all sorts of different applications, but it won't cover use in food contact materials unless it's an environmental risk. So it could, in theory, you could have someone saying, well, the phthalates mentioned are environmental endocrine disruptors, that's agreed, therefore we will put them on to the authorization list, and you could have a situation where that could cover food contact uses, but purely as an environmental exposure route. But REACH authorization would not be allowed to cover human health exposures. It's expressly forbidden in the legislation. So you have, so a chemical can be subject to a lot of pressure from authorization, and it still has no impact on food contact use. The other thing it's worth saying is that REACH can also restrict chemicals, and there is actually a restriction proposal for those 4 phthalates that are mentioned in the study. But interestingly, as it stands, I did just have a look at it. As far as I can tell, the restriction proposal currently exempts uses in food contact materials. So it will be a restriction on those, materials containing those phthalates. It's subject to various conditions, but that won't cover food contact because there's constantly a belief, essentially within the REACH system, sometimes enforced by the REACH law itself, that food contact chemicals should be being addressed by the food contact system. But as we can see, they often aren't.
Isn't it also a difference between the aims of the different regulations? So, I mean, REACH clearly aims at gradually getting rid of SVHCs, right? So you need to get an approval for using SVHCs, and you have to renew that every 5 years. And so the aim clearly is that these substances gradually are substituted. Whereas with the food contact regulation, we do have restrictions for use. I mean, the phthalates, as Birgit showed, they have specific migration limits. Certain uses are exempted, but still it's a positive list in food contact regulation, which means that there's no incentive to gradually substitute these substances.
Yes, I mean, if something gets into authorization, once it's in that process, there will be, if an authorization is given, it will be for a fixed number of years. It doesn't have to be 5 years. It can be as little as 2, or who knows how many. To some extent, we don't know yet. I think there's at least 1 up to 12, one use. So yes, there is this continued pressure, and I think it's part of a wider issue, which is what you call generic versus specific risk assessment. And essentially what you have is the idea that where you have chemicals with certain properties, which are very problematic properties, where you may have issues with thresholds, you may have other issues, then the material, you have the idea that you try not to use those substances in certain sorts of applications. And you see this with cut-off limits to do with CMRs in toys, for example, or various things that go on with pesticides and biocides. So that's the most, on one end you can say, well, we'll just stop using them, which is what the toys approach uses. On the other end, you say, well, we don't do anything without a specific risk assessment, which is essentially what's happening with food contact materials. Or in the middle, you can have the authorization approach where you just make it much more difficult for them to be used, and there's a lot more testing of whether there are safer alternatives available. So, so a carcinogen, as an example, or an endocrine disruptor, might be restricted automatically from toys. Authorization would say, well, you're going to have to apply if you want to carry on using it. As far as I would work out at the moment, the food contact materials regulation would just say fine, as long as you can do a risk assessment. So there's a lot of assumption in the food contact materials world that risk assessment, specific risk assessment, is perfection. Yeah. Whereas the reality, of course, is that all these risks, the hazards, and the exposure are always being estimated all the time. And for many of these materials, those estimates change over time. So something becomes the real risk as opposed to the estimated risk is a lot worse than what you initially believe. And this is one of the reasons for generic risk assessment approaches.
And you also have to operate with a lot of uncertainties. Okay, great. Thanks, Michael. I have another question for Birgit. We normally consider the plastic food contact materials as relatively well regulated compared to paper and board coatings, etc. And therefore, in general, a safer alternative. Would you say that your study, Birgit, points to a different conclusion?
To compare the plastics regulation with the other regulations, or could you quickly repeat this question? I'm sorry.
That we normally consider plastic food contact materials as relatively well regulated.
Okay, yes.
And that they're a safer alternative. Would you say that from our study, we would come to a different conclusion, that plastics are less safe?
Well, I think we cannot compare plastics with other materials based on this study. But the plastics regulation itself, I think it contains a lot of effort, but still it's not perfect. And the other regulations, if you look at other materials, there are even bigger gaps. Coming back to the plastics regulation, if you look at this, you see that you usually just look at the starting substances, or you just evaluate the starting substances and the additives, and still the substances may be used at higher concentrations, or still other substances may be present, but that's not a problem of the regulation, of course, but that's the manufacturer is doing something completely wrong if the concentrations are too high. However, Michael mentioned NIAS, and I think if you just look at starting substances and additives and produce a plastic, you will produce a lot of substances in the end, which are present in the material and are not regulated at all, because the reactions are so complex and the material you produce is so complex, so you will have many other things and many more chemicals which you didn't look at in the beginning. That's the problem maybe with the plastics regulation and the material itself. And maybe it can be transferred to other materials, but that's a big field, and it also, again, strongly depends on the material itself then.
Okay, great. Thank you, Birgit. Yeah, well, as Michael mentioned, the argument is that there's too many substances to regulate. The latest JRC baseline study report gave an actual number of about 8,000 substances. So it's a bit less than what REACH is trying to do. But yeah, we will see. We will see what happens with food contact material regulation in the near future. Okay, and with that, I would like to close the Q&A session. Thank you to Birgit, thank you to Michael, and thanks to everyone who was asking great questions. I would like to just finish off. Once again, I'm challenged by the technology here, to finish off with some save the date remarks here for you, and I'll try and let you see these. So we have our next webinar scheduled. It's going to be held on the 25th of April, and the topic will be food contact material regulation in China. We have as a guest speaker Dr. Marco Zong, who is director of the National Reference Laboratory for Food Contact Materials in Guangdong. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He will be sharing the history of how the new Chinese FCM regulation came about, because he was actively involved in developing it, and he will also highlight some of the main differences between European and US regulation, and I hope we will have time to answer the question whether Chinese food contact regulation now is the safest and best in the world. And then I would also like to invite you to save the date for our annual workshop. It will be held on the 5th of October this year in Zurich, Switzerland. It's our 5th workshop, and the topic of our workshop this year is scientific challenges and the risk assessment of food contact materials. We have a host of speakers confirmed already from industry, Nestle, Coca-Cola, academia, public interest groups, enforcement and regulatory authorities. So I invite you to keep an eye on our website, and we will open registration, I think, at the end of May. That's the plan. Great. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, and hope to see you at our next webinar. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.